The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Local Support for Aging Services, an Island of Promise in a Sea of Uncertainty. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate in today's event. When you've joined today's webinar, you selected the option to join either via by phone call or computer audio. If for any reason you would like to change your selection, you can do so by accessing your audio pane in the control panel. You will also have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your question into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your question at any time. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce John Feather, CEO of Grantmakers in Aging and moderator for today's webinar. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Leo, and thank all of you for joining us today. As always, we want to thank the John A. Hartford Foundation, whose ongoing support for our Conversations webinar series allows us to offer these webinars free of charge to our audience. Property tax levies have been used to support programs for older adults since the early 1970s. Currently, 1/3 of states across the nation have used local funding to support aging services. Today, we will learn about the use of levy programs and the challenges and opportunities associated with this model. We are joined by Nancy Zweibel, the Senior Program Officer with the Retirement Research Foundation, Robert Applebaum, Director of the Ohio Long-Term Care Research Project, and Professor of the Department of Sociology and Gerontology and a Scripps Research Fellow at the Scripps Gerontology Center, Miami University, and Ken Wilson, Vice President of Program Operations at the Council on Aging of Southwestern Ohio. We welcome you all. As was mentioned earlier, you can enter your questions in the question box on the right side of your screen at any point. I will be reading these questions to our panelists during the question and answer session at the end of their presentation. Please feel free to open that and do that at any point, including now. First, we're going to be hearing from Nancy, who's going to be talking about retirement research work funding in this important area. Nancy?
Thanks, John. And thank you, everybody, for attending today and for the panelists for joining me on this. So I just wanted to share a little bit about why IRS was interested in seeing this topic covered in a GIA webinar, and that was the result of some work we did to fund research into what the foundation might do to support services for family caregivers. The decision was made by the planning group that accessing federal dollars is going to be increasingly difficult. So Bob proposed this notion of local referenda, and it resonated with me because we've had experience funding advocacy to promote the passage of local levies, and so we gave Scripps a 2-year grant of nearly $200,000 to begin to study how the existing programs that are out there, if at all, address the needs of caregivers and what we can do to promote that, with the hope that eventually there'll be a learning collaborative and even advocacy for new levies to support caregivers. Next slide. So just to give you a little view of what we've done in the past, we have had 3 grants in this arena in the last decade or so, and the 2 that are most relevant here today are the grants in Missouri and Florida, where particularly Missouri, with a relatively small investment, we enabled an advocacy coalition in the St. Louis County area to pass a levy program that raises $2 million a year. Now, obviously spread over every older adult in the city of St. Louis will be a very small amount of money, but the program dollars are passed through to community-based organizations that have eligibility criteria for many of their services. So the dollars tend to go a fairly long way for the people that are served. And in Florida, our investment was really intended mostly for planning purposes, but they're making good progress down there as well. All right, I'm going to just turn this over to Bob. I'll be happy to take any questions about our experience at the end of the webinar. Take it away, Bob.
Thanks, Nancy, and thanks. Okay, thank you, and thanks, Nancy, and thanks everyone for being here. Ken and I will share the stage on this front, and we have a slide overviewing where we're going. There we go. Okay, so what we're going to do today is talk to you a little bit about the background for senior levies. We'll give you a little history from Ohio, which is a state that has embraced this approach with enthusiasm and passion. And then what Ken is going to do is talk to you about his particular region in Ohio, which is really one of the state leaders, and he has passed levies in every one of the counties that they work with as an area agency. And then we'll save a little time at the end to talk about the policy and implications of all this. So that's what we're going to do over the next half hour or so. So as way of background, most of you on the call realize that the Older Americans Act, which is really the funder of supportive services, has been essentially flat really since the early 1980s. And of course, the population of older people has risen dramatically in that time period. So the amount of money that we have for supportive services per capita has gone down, and many of us believe that this is a serious problem with the system. Support for things like caregiving services and support for just general supportive services is just not there. Our argument is that our strategy that we're using in this country is 100% wrong. It's completely driven by Medicaid, and I work with a lot of states, and in every state, they're so worried about Medicaid expenditures that it dominates state policy. Well, the problem is that in most states, less than 10% of the older population is actually eligible for Medicaid. People don't become eligible for Medicaid until pretty much the wheels fall off, when they end up in a nursing home or they have so much long-term services needs or so much health care need that they just end up impoverished. And so we have a system that spends a lot of money on people after something bad happens, but almost no money on people to help them not get into that situation. And support for caregivers is just a great example for that. The resources that we have available for caregiving in this country is almost nothing. And we know that for older people to remain viable in the community when they experience disability, the family is going to be the heart, or informal caregivers are going to be the heart of them being able to remain in the community, and our support for that is almost non-existent. So a number of local communities have tried to respond to the fact that we don't expect to have a lot of new federal money, as Nancy indicated. And as John said, we do have around 18 states that have generated local funds in communities. Some of them are big, some of them are small, some of them are red states, some of them are blue states, but the fact is we're beginning to see more and more communities around the United States who are beginning to figure out how to generate local funds in recognition that the federal dollars that we're spending are not being spent in this area. Most of the places are using property tax levies the way we fund schools, but we are seeing everything from earmarked income taxes to parking garage revenue, sales taxes, you name it. There have been some big new additions. The city of San Francisco has recently generated a new levy. So we are seeing more growth in this area every day, but certainly we think it's one option for local communities to try and take more control over the system, because by and large the federal system, and even to much extent the state systems, have just can't get out of the Medicaid driven focus. And we think that that's the wrong focus, because we're not focusing on people when they really need the help. We're focusing on it after all things have gone wrong. If we can go to the next slide, please. I wanted to talk just a little bit about Ohio's levy experience. Ohio is a state that has never had a state-only funded home care program, which is different from many states. But the story for this levy is interesting. Literally in the early 1970s, a little old lady in Claremont County, which is next to Cincinnati, went to the county commissioners at the time to say, our county is growing. We really need a senior center and some services for older people. And the county commissioners, as they're wont to do, said, we think that's a great idea. Her name was Lois Brown. And we think it's a good idea, Lois, but we just don't have the resources. And so Lois said, well, how about if we think about using local property taxes, the way we fund schools to support this program? And the county commissioner said, again, Lois, that's a great idea, but we actually can't do that because the Ohio legislature has said we can only use property taxes for certain areas. So she then went and spent the next 2 years lobbying the Ohio legislature. And she was able to get them to change the law so that property tax levies could indeed be used for senior services. And she went back to Claremont County, and lo and behold, got a levy passed in that county for a senior center and for aging services. That was in the mid-1970s. Today in Ohio, of our 88 counties, 74 of them have property tax levies to fund senior services. Last year, they raised about $190 million. Sometimes one person can make a difference. It doesn't happen often, but sometimes they can. And in this case, Lois set a trend for the state that has had a remarkable impact on aging services across the state. We actually just recently did a study looking at the support for levies, and it probably will be no surprise to you that it's very good politics. Ohio had 61 levies in the last 6 elections. The passage rate was 98%, and the voter margin was more than 70%. Those of you that follow voter margins in the United States will know that nothing gets 70% of the voters. So this is truly quite an interesting finding and very good politics. The other thing that when we looked at levies, though, interestingly, we found that other levies, park and rec and police and fire, also passed at very high rates, 94, 92%. Health and human service levies at 84%, and even educational levies in the state passed at almost 80%. And so levies at the local level do have pretty good support, although obviously aging services levies have better support than anything else, certainly in our state. If we could see the next slide, please. Just out of curiosity, we also analyzed in Ohio, when we looked at levies, the red and blue counties, and we did that by looking at counties that supported Trump or Clinton. And what we found was there was no difference in passage rate depending on whether they were a red or a blue county. And so one of the things that we take away from this is, even though there's a lot of rhetoric about people don't want to pay taxes and there's a tax revolt in Washington, what we are seeing is that even in relatively conservative areas of the state, if people know what they're voting for, they're willing to support such a levy. And so that's why we think that this concept of locally supported programs is something that is generalizable to the nation, no matter what the local politics are, because when people see the results, they tend to support it. And so we think that this has a potential for supporting programs all over the United States. Next slide, please. I wanted to give you a very brief overview of the levy programs in Ohio, and I will tell you, if you take a look at the 18 states that have levies, Ohio is by far the largest state in terms of generating funds. The Ohio levies do vary dramatically. We have one levy that funds only about $10,000 worth of service, and we have one levy that provides annually $35 million. There's also tremendous per capita support difference, some at $3 and the most expensive one at $250. There's lots of variation in how they do this. Typically, they use either 60 or 65. They typically have some kind of disability threshold, but it's usually moderate as opposed to severe that we face in the Medicaid waiver program. Most often they use care managers to assess and to coordinate, and they also use a sliding scale for income. So one of the problems is that the Medicaid home and community-based waiver programs serve only people with severe disability who are very much impoverished. And what we do in these levies is go up the disability scale and up the income scale as a way of being more preventative. These levies across the state now serve almost 200,000 people a year. So there's a lot of people being served, which also is one of the reasons why it makes for good politics, because when they're up for re-election, and Ken will talk about that a little bit more in a minute, they have lots of community support. Next slide, please. This is just a list of the typical services that we found in a survey of levy programs in Ohio. It's no surprise that homemaker personal care and meals and transportation are the top services, because this is what people who need social support need. Next slide, please. And then this is just an area of supplemental services in addition to those core services you saw earlier, and it's everything from supporting senior centers to INR to supporting caregivers, as you can see on this list. So there's really a wide array of services, both core services and supplemental, that are provided, and Ken will give you more examples from his specific program as we move through. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do now is actually turn this over to Ken. He operates a number of programs across the southwest region of Ohio, and he'll talk to you about how they do it, and then also how they actually implement the levy, and maybe a little bit about the levy politics, and then we'll come back at the end and talk a little bit about philosophy. So Ken?
Thank you, Bob. So we operate 4 levy programs in our region, and all 5 of our counties have levies, but we administer 4 of them. And the levies are targeted at older adults with moderate disability that are trying to stay independent in the community. So our purpose is to keep seniors independent as long as possible in their own home. Eligibility, there is variation from county to county. There's variation in age. There's also some variation in level of care. We use a combination of ADLs and IADLs to determine eligibility, and one of our counties has tighter eligibility, so they target a more frail population. Also, we serve people of all incomes, and there's a sliding fee scale that starts out at 150% of poverty. You have a 5% copay, and that goes all the way up to 100% copay. Depending on the county, there's between 25 and 40% of the clients share in the cost of their services. Next slide. The typical client that we're serving is a single woman in her 80s who has chronic, often complex health conditions, is periodically hospitalized and rehabilitated in skilled nursing facilities, needs help with cooking, cleaning, and dressing and shopping, lives on a modest and fixed income, and needs more help than what friends and family are able to provide. So the levy is designed to meet the needs of what family can't do, but not to supplant what they're currently doing. Next slide. This is a list of the services that are provided through our programs. As you can see there, it's a wide variety of services that are pretty similar to what you would find in most Medicaid waiver programs, including adult day, care management, a variety of home care services, emergency response devices, transportation, home delivered meals, independent living assistance, medical equipment and supplies, home safety modification, and environmental services. Next slide. We also have a relatively new program that's embedded in what we call the Elderly Services Program, and that's called Fast Track Home, which is designed for seniors that are in hospitals or in nursing facilities to be determined eligible and for services to begin prior to discharge. So with this new program, it's a 60-day model with the option of receiving ongoing services after the 60 days. But a bedside assessment is done by a credentialed hospital coach, and services are arranged prior to discharge, and then a follow-up in-home visit is done within 3 days of discharge. And then a full in-home assessment is done after 45 days. So this is very similar to the Coleman model, but we've attached the community-based services onto that. The most popular services with Fast Track Home are home delivered meals and transportation. Next slide, please. This is where our levy expenses are going. So you can see the drivers of our budget are home care assistance, that encompasses homemaking and personal care, home delivered meals, and case management. We have a variety of other options that are smaller dollar amounts. As you can see, we have a consumer-directed care option, which, by the way, is growing because of the labor shortage problems we're having with our home care providers. Our administrative cost, I'll point out, is 6%. So here's an overview of our levy revenue by county. And as you can see, in Ohio, we define levy amounts by millage. And that's just a calculation done by the county auditors and defined by Ohio law that measures the amount that's collected per valuation of the home. So in general, 1 mil of property tax levy is about $30 to $35 per year for a $100,000 home. That's in general what that means. So our average collection across all these counties is somewhere between $39 and $42 per $100,000 of valuation on the property. As you can see, we have a wide range of size of the levy. Our smallest county, Clinton County, generates $1.3 million a year. Our largest county, which is Hamilton County, which is home to the city of Cincinnati, generates $26 million a year. Next slide. We have a variety of roles as levy administrator. So it's not just about providing the services, but we own a care management software system that also manages all the claims submitted by the providers. Not that different from a managed care organization. We also provide the county with a lot of budget support, financial projections, and co-pay billing back to the clients for the services that they receive. We also manage the contracted providers that are delivering the direct care to make sure that they're quality. We have a business intelligence department that measures the quality and measures the performance of the program. We're also responsible for policy development, as well as educating the community and the local political governments and engaging them and educating them about the program. Next slide. This is a look at one of our measures, which is we call market penetration, where we are looking at how much of the community need is being met by one of our programs. The blue area is the local levy funded program, and the other colors are Medicaid programs. And the numerator of this model is community dwelling seniors that are living in the community with disability. And that's how many people, the numerator is how many people we're serving on that program, and the denominator are how many people are actually living in the community. So you can see about 55% of the seniors in the community that have disability are receiving services from one of our programs. And one of the things that's striking about this is the large number of people that are benefiting from the county levy program. If you hear all the talk about all the Medicaid programs at the state and federal level, it doesn't match up with the need in the community that's being met by the levy programs, not even by a long shot. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about passing a levy. The first levy to go on the ballot, you need to have legislative taxation authority that Bob spoke about earlier, which in Ohio we have that thanks to Lois and her advocacy. And that policy at the state level allows counties to put the levy on the ballot and defines the language and the scope of what those levies can be. Putting that first levy on the ballot, you also have to generate the need for the levy and develop community support for the levy. And the way we've effectively done that the first time around was doing a needs assessment by an independent party to show what are the needs in the community for this levy. There's also a large community organizing need to mobilize volunteers, mobilize locally that can communicate the need to voters and also local government officials. In Ohio, there were two options for putting the levy on the ballot. One is a petition drive, or the county commissioners can just vote on it themselves to place the levy on the ballot. In our situation, we did a petition drive because it removed the politics of a county commissioner having to put a new levy on the ballot, which is not politically popular. So with every levy that's operated, so we have to renew a levy every 5 years. They expire every 5 years. They're back on the ballot. And there's a process that goes behind putting those levies back on the ballot, which involves the Board of County Commissioners, and each county may have a different tax levy review process, which could be working with county administration, or in some cases, an outside consultant and audit that's done prior to the commissioners making a decision about a renewal of the existing levy or putting an increase on the ballot. We also have to maintain good relationships with each county administrator, the county auditor, who tells us what the valuation and millage rates are and how much money it will draw, and also the Board of Elections, who has to actually put the levy language on the ballot properly. We also form a campaign entity that's separate from ourselves. I work for a nonprofit 501c3 organization, so we have a separate organization called Citizens Supporting Our Elderly, which is a 501c4 organization, which is allowed to do advocacy. We had to form a volunteer campaign committee and recruit many, many volunteers, and also have management of the levy campaign itself. And sometimes that we've had paid management of the campaign. In other cases, it's all volunteer. And all campaigns have to have strategy and a fundraising arm to raise the money to put the levies on the ballot. Next slide. So a little bit about politics. All politics are local, especially with these local levy programs. And it's always important to keep the relationships and develop those relationships in the local counties and with the communities themselves. First-time levies and any increases to any levies are always controversial, and there's always a lot more involved in that first campaign and any campaign where there's an increase. We've also run, in my history, we've run into a variety of threats from service providers, and this can present itself in many different ways. We're positioning ourselves to provide the best quality services to the seniors and also be good stewards of the tax dollars to the taxpayers. And that's always the line that we take. But sometimes local service providers, who may be local employers, do not agree with decisions that we're making. or are not competitive, are not providing quality services. And when decisions are made or they start to lose money, that creates local controversy that has to be managed. We've also encountered threats for repurposing funding, mostly from county commissioners who may look at the levy to fund other mandated initiatives that they have. In some cases, they're appropriate things, such as adult protective services. Other times, there are things, in my view, are inappropriate, such as public transportation funding. The quote at the bottom of the slide is our operating principle that we always use with operating our levy and to kind of guide our ship through the local politics of a levy, which is always making sure that our decisions are based on providing the highest quality services at the lowest cost to be able to serve as many seniors with the tax dollars as possible. All politicians they will not argue with that and will agree with any decisions that line up with that principle. Next slide. This is some data about our local campaign expenditures. So this is inclusive of the most recent levy campaigns when they were placed on the ballot and how much money had to be raised to operate those campaigns. So in total, as you can see, we spent almost $332,000 to operate 4 levy campaigns. And those vary dramatically. Hamilton County by far was our most expensive at $250,000, and our smallest was Clinton County. So the strategies behind these county levies are different depending on the population, the size of the levy, and the communities themselves. That Clinton County levy, the campaign consisted of yard signs and public speaking, and we also did a direct mailing to voters. Hamilton County included billboards, a lot of Facebook ads, social media, and radio. Next slide. So this is a look at where our fundraising sources come from. So in raising that $332,000 to operate those 4 levy campaigns, you can see most of it came from our contracted providers. 27% COA, that's us, so that's Council on Aging, that's my organization. And the majority of the rest of it all came from providers. When we first started doing this, there was a significant amount that came from corporate. In Cincinnati, Kroger's and Procter & Gamble used to be, for example, big donors to these campaigns, but that has declined over time because they're global companies now and are not interested in just local community. They're interested in national impact. So we've had to rely more and more on providers, some of our local contacts to raise the money. Next slide. Here's a history of voter support in one of our counties, our largest county, from the very first levy, which was passed in 1992, through our last campaign in 2017. And as you can see, in the 2017 campaign, we had a 37% increase on the ballot. There was a lot of controversy behind that, and that was one of the hardest campaigns that I've ever worked on. But at the end of the day, voters came through and passed it by a 72% margin. The other interesting thing is there's a lot of vote fluctuation between the campaigns, whether there's a presidential election on the ballot, or if it's just a gubernatorial election, or if it's an off-year election. And in my experience, presidential elections, which brings out a lot more voters, has a positive impact on the outcome of our ballot initiatives. The first levy to be placed on the ballot always has the smallest margin, and you always lose some voters whenever you have an increase, because when there's a renewal, which means property taxes are not going up, that's where we have the largest support, and those are the easiest campaigns to run. Next slide.
Okay, so you've gotten an overview of the specifics of what Ken was talking about. And there are some philosophical or policy questions that certainly are raised. Some people raise the question about whether a property tax is the best tax. It's not as progressive as, for example, an income tax. And so we've had lots of debate over the years about property taxes. You know, and I think at the end of the day, for many of us, yes, you could argue that as a nation, we maybe should have a different form of taxation. Maybe we should have more progressive taxation policy to fund services. But I think for many of us at this point, what we see very clearly is that the expenditures from federal government and from state government are really much more focused on Medicaid and on people when the wheels really fall off, but we believe that's really the wrong strategy, because if you can spend money to help people maintain themselves in the community, to help families support themselves, that you have a much better chance of being penny wise and pound foolish. And so at this point, even though it may not be the ideal system, we think that funding local services is both good politics and good policy. And in an ideal world that may be different, but this is the world we live in. And so certainly, as you can see from the voter outcomes, it's very good politics. And we think having local control to be able to fund services in the community also turns out to be good policy, because those agencies have to pay attention to the local needs in a way that's very different. So we think that this has potential to be able to create a system that's much more preventative in nature, that's much more able to help people maintain independence in the community. And we think, given the constraints on both federal and state funding, this is an opportunity for future communities. And while Ohio is certainly the largest state in this area, there are a number of states that have embraced this. And we also think that we may be able to do better in this area with supporting caregivers, and that's something we're going to be working on with in our next project with our funding from Retirement Research Foundation that we're moving into beginning this June. So we're going to stop here and take questions for you from the audience, and thank you for letting us share our work in this arena, and we look forward to questions from the community.
Well, thank you so much, all three of you, for that really great presentation. For some folks, depending on where they live in the country, this will be a very familiar issue. For some people, it's probably a revelation that these kind of levies occur and how they work. So we have a number of questions already, but I want to remind you that if you open the question box, which is in the control panel on the right side of your screen, you will see a question box. You just open that and type in your questions, and I'll be asking it to our participants. So, Paul and Bob, you've already talked a good deal about the both policy and politics of how this works. But this question really is: are there national or local resources or organizations who can help with the advocacy work? I think it's not so much about the having somebody physically do that, but that can provide expertise around this issue. Who should they go to?
Well, I'd like to take it if I could, Bob.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I just want maybe Bob has comments that he'd like to make as well, but I can tell you that the folks in Miami-Dade County are using a political consultant who is allowing them to understand sort of what's happening. They're at the state in Florida that Ohio was at the very beginning, where they have to get their state legislature to allow them to put this on the ballot. And so the consultant, who I think then would become a good resource for anyone around the country, because it's not specific to, I mean, he can speak to how you go about it and what questions you need to be asking and what things you need to be looking at, even though he's particularly expert in the politics of Tallahassee. I think if anybody wants to contact me after this, I can put you in touch with the folks in Miami-Dade at United Way who are running that campaign. So that's all I have to say about that. Maybe Bob has other comments.
So this is Ken. I would add that having local political expertise is a good recommendation. We've had good success with hiring local political consultants that have had success with candidate campaigns to help with strategy around local levy issue campaigns. And there are differences. I mean, levy campaigns are not the same as electing a legislator, but the strategies behind how to educate the community, how to do the messaging, what are the communities that we need to target, and how do you target voters? For example, absentee ballots, and how do you get the message out to people who are voting absentee? Local political consultants can take that knowledge of how to work with the local board of elections and how to put a strategy together for your local community very well.
And the other thing I would add is one of the things that we've seen in Ohio as these levy campaigns began to take a foothold around the state, we began to see more and more interest. And so at state conferences in aging and other areas, we would have workshops on how to put together a levy, and some of the successful levy programs actually have been working with other communities. So I think that as you get success, it sort of breeds additional success, and certainly we're hoping in a new grant funded by the Retirement Research Foundation, where we're trying to get more information about how communities are doing this, that we will also put out information about success, and we hope that this will continue to spark the flame of interest in this area.
And if I could just add quickly, you know, one of the things that was said in the presentation was that the counties in Ohio use a have a separate 501c4 so that they can advocate. It's probably not news to the funders on the call, but of course it doesn't have to be a 501c4 if you're not talking about a piece of legislation specifically. We funded only 501c3s because that's all we're allowed to fund, and they're able to do education both of the public and legislators about the need for additional revenue to support older adults, and it doesn't cross the line into lobbying. So that's all I have to say.
Great. I guess there are two states over from you, and Missouri has a question, and that's to say that you talked a good deal about the process of the 5-year renewal and the strategies around that. But Missouri has a permanent system, so once it's put into place, it does not need to be revoted on. Is that something that other states are doing, or do you find that this is the process that you have is more common?
So, in my experience, that all comes back to what the revised code says for that state and putting that tax on the ballot. In Ohio, there are some levies, like the developmental disability system, for example. They're allowed to put a permanent ongoing levy on the ballot. In Ohio, for aging services, that's currently not allowed. 5 years is the max. They can do less than 5 years, but they can't do more than. And there has been some discussion about getting that changed because there's a cost to running these levy campaigns, and 5 years goes really quickly.
In most of the states that we've seen, they are sort of time-limited, renewable. but that is in the study that we're about to embark in. We'll get more detailed information by states and localities to be able to answer that question. But I think Missouri is more unique in that front than is typical.
Okay. Another question related to the broadness of this particular arena. There are many states who have moved into this direction. Do you have a sense of why the majority of states still have not?
That's a great question, and we have had some pushback from people who've said, well, this won't work in our state. Our state already has too high property taxes. This is not the focus of our state. So I think there's, certainly the property tax, as we know, is not, it's a regressive tax in the sense that your house may have gone up in value, but you don't have income that goes with it. We've certainly seen property tax revolts in many states, led by California. So there is a little bit of concern about the property tax, and a concern that in some communities, particularly states with very high property taxes already, that this may not be a popular outcome. And one of the things that we've said is that, as Ken mentioned, the millage for a tax like this is relatively low compared to things like school levies. And so in most communities, it still doesn't add a whole bunch to the cost of somebody's property tax. And so we think it's an attractive option, but certainly the property tax is regressive, and in some states with very, very high property taxes, that's an issue. Some states have gone a different route to local funding, either via sales tax, or again, there was a state that had a parking garage tax. So there are other options to do this, and certainly there's some concern about property taxes. But in general, what we've seen in where states have done this, it's been very good politics. And even in Ohio, we have some very, very red counties who have not been very supportive of tax increases, who have voted quite positively for this. So it's been good politics, but certainly everything is local. As they say, all politics are local, and so it is going to vary by state, and whether it's something that's going to be acceptable in your state is certainly going to vary, and even by locality.
I would just add that, I think part of this is, a lot of these efforts are driven by local advocacy organizations, which have a whole variety of issues on their agenda. And so some of it may relate just to a sort of a lack of insight about the value that something like this has, and how many are out there in the country. That's just an instinct on my part, but all three of the projects we've been involved with have come from local advocates. So I'm just going to assume that they're uninformed, or perhaps reticent.
It's hard.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, John. I was just going to say it's just hard to do. This is for most local agencies, the idea of raising funds and supporting a political campaign is not the norm. And so Ken kind of described to you sort of the infrastructure and the challenges, and for most agencies, this is certainly a new arena.
That's absolutely true. For our last question, we're going to switch gears just a bit, and the question is, with the new flexibilities for medical care providers to pay for social supports, might there be a community-wide initiative to reduce hospital and skilled nursing facility use, and to pay for community coffers back at least some of the investment using a pay-for-performance kind of model?
Wow, I love that question. This is something I've been thinking quite a bit about because there's a lot of change going on with the Affordable Care Act, and then we recently had the Chronic Care Act, which passed, and we're seeing more and more Medicare Advantage plans that are interested in social determinants of health and paying for services that, in our case, have traditionally funded with the levy dollars. So I think there is an emerging and big opportunity to work with health plans and with health systems as payment reform evolves to find a new funding model that will share in the savings and allow us to provide more services to seniors. And I have not figured this problem out yet, but it is an emerging opportunity that I believe is growing. And I think, you know, it is a possible way of leveraging, in my case, it's leveraging what we've already done with the Elderly Services Program and the levy funding as an investment to share in the savings with healthcare that we're generating by lowering readmissions and by lowering healthcare costs in general by providing better care.
I think the challenge with this is that even if you go back as far as one of the early demonstrations in this arena called the social HMO, which tried to combine social long-term services with managed care back in the 1990s, and even when it was the same organization, the culture of acute care and health care and the culture of supportive services and long-term services have traditionally not meshed. And I think the jury's still out on how this will all come together. But typically, the acute care and healthcare model has not been very focused on these kinds of social supports, and it's kind of been like the 500-pound gorilla in the room. And so we'll have to see how it plays out. There's potential for promise, but it's not clear. And as I said at the beginning, you know, we have a world where, you know, all of our infrastructure for long-term services is run through the Medicaid program, and that's targeted at very low-income people who are highly disabled, and that's not most older people. And still is the case that most older people with disability are being cared for by family and friends, and it's only when really things fall apart that the public sector comes in through Medicaid. And so we think that a more efficient allocation of resources through these local funds could eventually actually reduce costs to the system, but most states are not focused on that, and I'm not sure that even the managed care plans through Medicare Advantage will truly make that transition, because at the end of the day, they're healthcare providers, and we've spent a lot of time with these organizations, and it's very difficult to change culture. In the planning world, we talk about the power of culture, and culture trumps strategy, culture trumps innovation any day of the week. So that's our challenge as we move forward.
Anthony, anything to add to that one?
That was, you said Nancy, right, John?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say I agree with Bob. We've had very little success with our grantees to date, and it's still young. I mean, the Chronic Care Act is, you know, what, less than a year old, and the managed care thing is also very new. But we've had very difficult experiences trying to get managed care and Medicare Advantage plans to partner financially with the social service sector, and even more with the health systems that may have Medicare Advantage plans. So I'm a bit of a pessimist about that, but then again, people who know me realize I'm a pessimist about a lot of things.
Well, at this point, I want to come back to our speakers and ask each of them to give their final words of wisdom to our audience. And Ken, we will start with you.
All right. Well, thank you. What I would say is I think this is a big opportunity in your local communities to raise funding to pay for important services for seniors. And there's wide evidence that there's public support across political spectrums and economic spectrums. And a lot of the reasons why communities haven't advanced is they're coming up with all these excuses and reasons why they can't do it. So I would encourage everyone to think about how you can do it rather than how you can't do it, because it's a big opportunity for your community.
Bob?
So I totally agree with Ken, and I will say that many years ago, when the Council on Aging was beginning to look at the levy, the CEO at the time came to me and he said, well, what about Butler County? And I said, oh my gosh, Butler County, where I live, is one of the most conservative counties in the state. I said, there's no way you'll pass a levy in Butler County. We don't pass school levies. We don't pass mental health levies. We don't pass anything. And at the time, a very popular baseball announcer in Cincinnati was a guy named Joe Nuxhall, for all of you that are baseball fans. And he got Joe Nuxhall to be the levy campaign chair, and it passed with about 75% of the voters. And so I sort of learned a lesson that sort of local services can be very good politics. And I think the fact is, we are not going to see large influxes of federal funding going to support services in the supportive range. And so this is an option that I think get legs, and I think we've seen a lot of success in that area.
Nancy, you've got the final word.
Don't I always, huh? No, I'm just kidding. I just want to make 2 points, and one is that the reason I was pleased to have this webinar topic is that this is such a strong option for the many members of GIA who are local funders. There are fewer of us that fund regionally, and even fewer that fund nationally. But here's an opportunity for community foundations, health conversion foundations, maybe even, and certainly family foundations at the local level to support advocacy that can produce millions of dollars in revenue for older adults and caregivers. And the other thing I wanted to say is that this conversation is giving me the idea. One of the long-term goals of the grant we made to Bob and his team is the possibility of funding a learning collaborative. So once we have more information about how caregiver services are supported in levies around the country, we might hopefully we'll make another grant to create a learning collaborative, and it's occurring to me now we may want to do that more generally to help funders know how these levies that exist already have been passed, independent of whether they serve caregivers or not. So keep your eyes open for that. No promises, but it's something I'm going to suggest internally. And thank you to everyone who was on the panel and to GIA for helping us organize this, and to those of you who are on the call.
Well, I want to thank Nancy Zweibel, Robert Applebaum, and Ken Wilson for their great work in making life better for older people. We also want to thank the Johnny Hartford Foundation for their support of this webinar. We will be making today's presentation available to anyone who wishes to view it later, free of charge, including both the slides and the audio. Watch for an email to be sent within a few days, or you can find the announcement on our website. And we hope you will join us for our next webinar on June the 3rd, as you see in the slide, Care Partners, Bridging Families, Clinics, and Communities to Advance Late Life Depression Care. A very important topic to many of our members. Watch for our website for registration information coming out in the next few days. And finally, I want to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. Have a great day.
Thank you.